There's nowhere near enough clarity for anyone who's managing a building. And that is still the case.
The £9 million refurb of Grenfell Tower was completed in May 2017, only a month before the fire.
The first thing that any tenant should expect is to be safe.
In 2017, a fire broke out in a tower block in West London. There was an electrical fault in a fridge on the 4th floor. By the time it was put out, 72 people were dead. Why did the fire spread so quickly, and why did so many people die? 7 years later, we finally have answers to those questions in the Grenfell report. This was not an unavoidable tragedy. Sir Martin Moore-Bick, the chair of the inquiry, says all these deaths were avoidable. But there's no single culprit. The building industry and the council are at serious fault. London Fire Brigade made mistakes too. But the reasons why they were able to get away with them go much deeper into the government's drive for deregulation in the early 2010s. John, much of this comes down to cladding. What is cladding? Why was it used on tower blocks?
I do feel this one a little bit personally because there is some cladding on the block I live in, which is a pain in the arse because it means I can't move. But basically what you're talking about here is kind of aluminium panels that you put on the outside of a building. Like they come in a number of different forms. In some of them, they've got plastic inside, sort of little cassette forms. But basically you kind of stick this stuff on the outside of a building partly because it can be, there are practical benefits to it. It can be weatherproofing. It keeps the building, it can hold heat inside the building. It can kind of like dampen external noise. But also there's an aesthetic function to it. Like if you've got kind of an old school concrete block, sticking some shiny panels on the side can just make it look more attractive. So it's kind of been treated as this way of improving a building without spending huge amounts of money for sort of more structural renovations. So in Grenfell itself, I didn't actually realise this. The £9 million refurb of Grenfell Tower was completed in May 2017, only a month before the fire, which is sort of unnerving, isn't it?
It is. How is it possible for the companies making this cladding to get away with supplying inflammable panels for, of all places, tower blocks?
I mean, there's a very long and complicated answer taking in almost everyone involved in this process, but the short version is that nobody stopped them. Like, I mean, we can, and we are going to bring up a lot of words to explain this in more depth, but it was just a complete regulatory failure. And if you do not, surely we know by now that if you do not place limits on the actions of corporate actors, they are sometimes going to do very, very stupid, short-sighted things in pursuit of profit. And that's basically what happened here. So the problem is that this cladding can, in certain forms, if it's done badly, it can basically transmit fire. Like the particular form that was a problem on Grenfell was the cassette form, where you've got these kind of folded over ones with like sort of very flammable plastic inside. And these cassettes were failing all the fire tests that the other forms of cladding they weren't doing brilliantly, but they were doing better on those tests. But a lot of the companies involved wanted to use the cassette version for, let's be honest, financial reasons, and it was a little bit cheaper. So the people buying this stuff did it. And basically there was, the report contains so many shocking quotes. The construction companies engaged in systematic dishonesty. They engaged in deliberate and sustained strategies to manipulate the testing process, misrepresent test data, and mislead the market. One company in particular was determined to exploit what it saw as a weak regulatory regime, such as that in the UK. Part of the problem was a lot of the companies that existed to, well, I've used the word companies, a lot of the organizations that existed to kind of issue the fire safety certificates were not public bodies, they were commercial companies. And their customers were the people making the construction supplies. So there is obviously immediately a conflict of interest there. And it's very difficult to be kind of like harsh on a company that's not meeting standards if they're also paying your bills. And that was true of a lot of the regulatory bodies involved. But at the other end of things, like how was this allowed to happen? Well, over decades, like we've just had this drive to cut red tape. It went into overdrive after 2010 because that was very much part of the sort of ideological basis for austerity and everything else the Cameron government was doing. But it massively predates that. Like we've not been sort of we've not seen regulation as a good thing, as something that's important for preservation of life and property for decades.
Yeah, let's talk about that. I mean, it's worth saying as well, I think, that the council are to blame because they also wanted to get the job done on the cheap.
And it's not a poor council, it's the richest council in Britain.
Yeah. Hannah, in the early 2010s, as we were saying, David Cameron announced a bonfire of red tape. Very unfortunate phrase in retrospect. What did that mean for building safety regulations?
I think it's important to say that as well as this bonfire of red tape, which we're just about to talk about, fire safety is much more of a mishmash of guidance and expectation than you'd expect. There's nowhere near enough clarity for anyone who's managing a building or constructing a building. And that is still the case. It's very much based on advice and guidance documents rather than pure regulation. But obviously, the actions of the Cameron government exacerbated that situation. So as part of this ripping up of red tape, the government did exclude something called the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005. And in doing so, they felt that they were ticking a box in, OK, we're preserving fire safety. But that wasn't enough because they didn't include from this destruction of regulation other forms of building regulations, the ones that housing developers and managers were focusing on more specifically, and various other documents that really had the most significant impact on how construction firms approached fire safety. And the government was told this by its own experts. It resisted calls from the fire sector to regulate fire risk assessors, to amend various orders to make it clear that fire safety did apply to the exterior of buildings, and produce more guidance that would specifically deal with cladding. It didn't do any of those things. So it absolutely directly contributed to the existing confusion around fire safety that allowed this to occur.
And how is Eric Pickles mixed up in this?
So under oath, Eric Pickles said that fire safety in its entirety had been excluded from the destruction of regulation, and that is incorrect. And as a result, the report refused to accept his evidence in its conclusions because it directly contradicted the facts, and they have documentation to demonstrate that. He also did something which I think proves that he's not fit to represent us anyway, additionally, which is that he blamed, and I quote, mid-ranking officials. Now, that kind of buck passing when you are the minister and you are responsible and there is evidence that your team was absolutely aware of what was going on is disgusting. He also claimed that no one had raised the issue of dangerous cladding with him personally throughout his time as Housing Secretary from 2010 to 2015. And that may be true, but they did raise fire safety. So it doesn't really matter whether it was cladding that caused the Grenfell fire and those 72 deaths. Fire safety was brought to his attention and it was not acted upon. So the report is very clear.
Pickles is a belligerent individual. I remember first coming across him in 2008 at a Tory party conference when he actually described himself as an insensitive sod.
Imagine being proud of that.
I quote, yeah. Should he, what kind of responsibility should he carry? What should be done?
So I think there are two clear reasons why he should be stripped of his peerage for his involvement. The first is that he was the minister in the department. And as a result, he and his team knew about the events in Lacanau House. This is another fire, also in a high-rise building, where 6 people died in a very similar blaze, also involving cladding. It was very well reported in the housing press. His team should have been reading that, even if he wasn't personally. His office knew also that local residents had been raising concerns, because again, this was all raised in the housing press. Grenfell TMOs, so that's the tenant management organisation who are responsible for managing Grenfell, they had raised these concerns in the light of Lacanau House. So there were 2 avenues for him to receive knowledge that a risk was possible, not only just in Grenfell, but in other tower blocks. And nothing was done by him or indeed by the team that he managed. And so the idea that he can sit in the House of Lords with all the privileges and the public money, the public support, public investment in him that entails, for me, it can't stand. He has to go.
What role did the local council, which ultimately managed the Grenfell Tower, play in all this? Because residents tried to raise concerns about fire safety, but they seem to have been ignored.
So the report found that the TMO and the council had consistently ignored their concerns because they essentially were ignoring residents' views about almost everything they were concerned about. There was this culture of dismissal. It wasn't just fire safety. The report concluded, and this is a quote, that the TMO had a persistent indifference to fire safety, particularly the safety of vulnerable people. And it found that they also had failed in their basic responsibilities to manage the block, in that there was absolutely no fire safety plan for disabled residents. In terms of providing an evacuation strategy for disabled residents in the case of an emergency. And disabled residents, it must be said, were overrepresented in the deaths. So that had a clear impact in the result. I think this raises important questions about the model of tenant management organisations, which are importantly voluntary management groups. And it's a very conservative policy to hand down responsibility to the people who are living and working in that area. But ultimately, we see the failure of that here. If you're allowing voluntary groups to run such a massive building with, and the lives of those people in the hands of a bunch of volunteers, you've got to feel that the council weren't doing their job in overseeing that TMO. So the complications in terms of the number of layers of management involved here, I think, add to it. And the council should take some responsibility for missing that the TMO was failing to perform.
Also, to stress again, it is the richest council in Britain. It is the one that really can't blame anything on cuts or austerity because it had so much money slopping around the place. And in the same period, it used it to give residents a council tax rebate. And it just didn't. The councillors just didn't seem to be thinking about the poorer residents on their patch and what responsibility they had towards them.
How many tower blocks still have flammable cladding on them? John mentioned that he lives in a block that has cladding.
So it's about 2,000 social housing blocks, but that's not the extent of it. About 2 years ago, the latest figures that were comprehensive, so all buildings, not just housing, there were about 10,000 buildings left. And so that's just a huge number with huge implications for public buildings as well as social residents and shared owners and homeowners living in those blocks.
And who's legally responsible for paying for it to be replaced?
So it's the building owners, many of whom are anonymous freeholders. We've talked previously about the leasehold situation in this country. And many of those freeholders where they have been contacted then want to pursue a developer that built the property in the first place, who may now be wound up. So it's been a huge issue for owners and residents in those blocks that sometimes they just can't get to the point where you find the person who is responsible. And the government has provided the funding to do that work. But getting it to happen is far more difficult.
John, there are practical things to do to make tower blocks safer. And then there are wider questions about why we let this happen in the first place. Do you think the Conservative, and some of them Lib Dem as well, politicians involved in this rush to deregulate, need to do some soul searching? I mean, the Conservative Home website, for example, has pretty much dismissed the report this week, saying it didn't really tell us much new.
I mean, they absolutely do. It feels like this should be the end of the line for a certain type of neoliberalism is probably the best way of putting it. The idea that, government regulation is in and of itself always bad. It is always something to be borne down on and removed. During the period of coalition government, they introduced a 1-in, 1-out rule for red tape, which later became a 1-in, 2-out rule and a 1-in, 3-out rule. Which was a numerical target that says absolutely nothing about whether or not those regulations may have been there for a reason.
So arbitrary.
Yeah, exactly. Ideally, you don't want unnecessary regulations, but you should be very careful about removing ones that are already there unless you know what they are there for, in what way they are protecting the public interest. I think this is a thing called Chesterton's fence, which is ironically enough an argument for conservatism. But there has been remarkably little soul searching on show from any of the people on that side of politics about what role their ideas and their ideology may have played in this disaster. In the same way, I think that we didn't really see anyone on the right of politics sitting back after the financial crash and going, oh dear, did we do this? I think it is just not something that is in the DNA of right-wing politicians in this country, very much to kind of think about, are we the baddies, basically?
I do agree. And I think there's definitely a culture of, release release capitalism to do what it may, and then we can prosecute afterwards. And I just don't think that that's what the people want.
No, 72 people are dead because of that attitude. It's horrendous.
But if Labour's house building programme takes off, a lot of new homes are going to be built pretty quickly. Some of those homes will be tower blocks. What does the government need to do to fix the regulatory system? Is it doing it, John?
They're not going to make this specific mistake again. I think like the cladding thing it's a legacy problem. But neither government nor regulator nor industry is going to be cocking up in that particular way again. So the report itself makes a number of recommendations, including like a much simpler regulatory system with a single regulator. There'll be a chief government construction advisor. Executives of the principal contractor on any project will be made personally responsible for taking all reasonable care for fire safety. The kind of common theme here is like every time it's like it is a much simpler system where you can point at an individual and say you are responsible for this. One of the problems highlighted by this report is that responsibility is so diffuse, with the possible exception of some of the executives at the construction materials companies. It is very difficult to point at individuals and say, you did this. The simpler system, which the government is saying it is considering, at least, would kind of make it possible to hold people responsible. And if people are responsible legally, they are more likely to make sure bad things do not happen.
I think actually we're in a situation where we haven't cared enough about the quality of our housing and the safety of our housing for years. Exactly as the way you described, there's been confusion and numbers of regulators and guidance documents and so on about every issue, not just fire, every single issue to do with safety. And it's so confusing that people don't understand what they're supposed to be doing, even when it's their professional role to do so. I recently wrote a feature for Inside Housing magazine about tower block falls. So we had a spate recently of deaths of children and young people from very high up, balconies and so on, and windows and tower blocks. And in researching that, it became clear that there is no one set of regulations about window safety either, which is just as important when you've got tiny children, being housed on the 23rd floor.
Well, I wanted to ask you about this because no one can say we don't talk about housing in this country. And there's always debate about the merits of new developments and protecting older buildings and housing ministers calling in decisions because they're so controversial. But we don't seem to care much about the rights and safety of the people living in housing that they don't own outright.
Absolutely. And perversely, under Pickles and in that era, all of the chat around housing was all about aesthetics and how things looked, and a great debate over whether brutalism is an art form or not, and all these pointless arguments, and missing the key issue that the first thing that any tenant should expect is to be safe. And that didn't come up.
There was one other thing that was discussed in relation to council housing in that period, which is whether we should be demolishing existing estates to rebuild at higher densities and more aesthetically pleasing housing. And, there is an argument for that. But the thing that was consistently missed throughout that conversation was the fact that these are people's homes that were being talked about as if it was just empty public land you could just redevelop without consequences. The existing tenants, or come to that, the owner-occupiers who bought former right-to-buy flats, were just not part of the conversation. And I think that really does need to change.
There was a requirement, wasn't there, put in place by Michael Gove, if I'm correct, for new housing to be beautiful? Yeah, which has now been dropped.
Do you remember there was a think tank guy called Philip Blond who had a lot of influence in the early Cameron era?
Blue Labour.
Yes, exactly. And he spoke a lot about that requirement for beauty and the aesthetics of development and how they impacted on people's well-being. Ultimately, the well-being that people really care about is being able to get out in a fire.
We're very excited to say that Podmasters is helping to launch a new podcast. Fortress Europe is a 7-part documentary series which shows how years of dehumanising anti-migrant policies have fanned the flames of extremism and failed to prevent record-high asylum applications. And joining me right now is the host, Andrew Connelly, who has written for Foreign Policy magazine, Newsweek, New Lines, Prospect and Vice, to name just a few. Andrew, welcome to Oh God, What Now?
Thank you.
You can listen to the first episode now. There's a link in the show notes. Andrew, thanks for joining us. Here in the UK, we're preoccupied with small boats and what to do about them. But would most Europeans be surprised to find out what happens at the borders of the EU?
I think they would, because if you take the last 10 years, so 2015, when we can maybe say the European refugee crisis started, if we use that term, people might remember boats coming to the Greek islands, and for a bit of time, people being welcomed, there being volunteers there, NGOs, kind of people helping out, and then people sort of gradually made their way through Europe to primarily Germany and Sweden and so on. And whilst that got a lot of attention at the time and media coverage of this issue waxes and wanes, a lot of the stuff that happens in between is actually characterized by the militarization and sharpening and hardening of all the borders of the European Union, and also the widening of the border. So the EU and various governments doing various deals with countries on the periphery, like Libya and Lebanon and Turkey and so on, all with the aim to keep asylum seekers out, but yet asylum applications have almost never been higher. So people think that governments are sort of doing something, let's say, to stop this problem as they see it. What they're not doing is obviously addressing what is a phenomenon, and people still arrive, but the difference is they suffer along the way. Fatalities increase en route, and governments seem to not be seen to be addressing this issue because they are promising their electorates that this thing can just disappear, which of course it can't, because a lot of the push factors, whether that's ongoing, say, repression in Afghanistan, still bombing in Syria, other kind of terrorism and violent situations and persecution elsewhere nearby Europe goes on. So the need is there. The demand for some people to reach Europe remains. And the legal avenues for them to do so remain narrow or non-existent.
And what are the big flashpoints, the big areas where people are trying to enter Europe and being pushed back?
So the first episode focuses on the Greek islands, which specifically the island of Samos. It's one of those islands in the Aegean Sea, which is so close to Turkey that you can see it, and therefore the reason why people are taking inflatable boats. Now, 10 years ago, you would arrive largely on the beach and be welcomed. Nowadays, if you're not intercepted directly by the Greek authorities in the middle of the sea, sometimes when their vessels are using quite dangerous maneuvers, you land, and the last thing you want to do is to present to authorities, because numerous reports of the Greek Coast Guard rounding up asylum seekers, putting them back into inflatable vessels and pushing them back to Turkish waters. And according to a lot of reporting, New York Times, also recently the BBC, sometimes even throwing them into the water. So what then happens is you have a lot of people arriving but not presenting. And you have a few people, some NGOs, Médecins Sans Frontières, for example, some activists, some locals, trying to not only help the people who are arriving, say, with medical support, but also witnessing that these people have arrived. They've put their feet on land. They are asylum seekers. Therefore, there is a legal process that should take place, which is you go to a reception center, your asylum claim is heard, and so on. What's happening now is a mass breach of all kind of national, European, and international laws. People are basically summarily expelled, and in some cases to their death. That's on the Eastern Aegean. There is also the Central Mediterranean, where people leave from Libya and other North African countries to Italy and Malta. Then also you have people leaving from, say, West Africa up to the Canary Islands, which is a quite popular route these days. And then to the east, you have the Belarusian border, which is a peculiar type of migration route whereby the dictatorship in Belarus has effectively enabled people with passports that are normally not very useful, that you always need visas for example, Somalia and Afghanistan and Syria, to land at airports in either Russia or Belarus and then be directed by Belarusian agents to the border of Europe and the Baltics in order to cross in a sort of, in quite a violent way. So that's just a flavour of some of the flashpoints in the EU migration routes. And
is that supported, if you like, by Russia with the aim of trying to destabilise Europe?
Yeah, sure. So it's certainly an act of, say, hybrid warfare. So what it is very cynically allowing people who are wanting to reach Europe in the first place. This isn't something that Russia has made them do. These are people that have reasons for going to Europe, whatever they may be. I mean, even I met people who were aware of the characterization that they were being described as somehow weapons against Europe, and they didn't see it that way. They said, look, I'm from Somalia. I had to escape al-Shabaab because of persecution. I have a relative in Europe. I was going to do this anyway. I then realized I could actually reach Europe by flying rather than boats. Now, what happens to them, of course, is that the Belarusians force them to cross into, say, Poland, but the Polish border guards are forcing them back into Belarus. This all happens very violently in the middle of Europe's largest forest, beyond the reach of any human rights observers whatsoever, in a very violent way. And so these people are basically caught in a quite sick game of human ping pong. So though it is, of course, engineered by Belarus and Russia, it is also the fact that Europe, which very much proclaims to have better human rights values than those two countries, are just summarily expelling these people back into very violent situations. So I think there's different kinds of blame to be spread around that quite miserable situation.
Britain always talks about a deterrent and what would deter people from coming here. And from what you've said to me, there really isn't anything that would deter people from coming to Europe. Is that right?
I mean, it's difficult to speak on the behalf of millions of people, I suppose. In some cases, sure, but on the whole, it seems that a lot of these people have very good reasons to, first of all, leave where they're from, and then settle in a place where they have a family member or friends, or even, let's face it, also labour market demands, if we're talking about migrants rather than asylum seekers. But look, I mean, I'll give an example. On Samos, I met a lady from Guinea. She attempted to arrive on the island almost about to give birth, about 9 months pregnant. And she was stopped so she says, by the border guards, assaulted, and then pushed back to Turkey. When she arrived in Turkey, she gave birth, and then a few weeks later, she made the same journey again with her newborn. I've also spoken to a man from Darfur in Sudan who tried to cross the central Mediterranean, was pushed back 3 or 4 times, with the EU air surveillance directing the Libyan Coast Guard to drag his boat back each time. He was also tortured upon arrival, extorted for money, and so on. He's now in the UK. So obviously, sometimes it can be money that might be a barrier, because you do need money to use the services of smugglers. That can sometimes be a problem. That might slow you down. Might not necessarily prevent you. It might mean that you won't reach where you want to for years, but you may get there in the end.
So when people suggest safer routes for migrants, is that, to you, is that the best way of dealing with this problem?
I think even if you had a very benevolent migration policy, even if you had lots of these safe legal routes, so let's say resettlement, there would still be small boats. You would still have irregular migration. So I think the point is not to say that neither we can stop all asylum seekers coming in, but neither will safe and legal routes solve the problem. But if you are a democratic country that signs up to these human rights treaties and also worry about the well-being of people living under regimes or in conflicts, of which also sometimes Europe has played a role, then you might be like, well, maybe perhaps there is a moral imperative to help some of these people. It's a discussion about how many people you do help, in order to also present an alternative to smugglers. Right now, the UK has effectively outsourced the access to the British asylum system to smugglers. Apart from Ukrainians, people fleeing repression in Hong Kong, everybody else can only really get here to put their feet on the territory by using smugglers. So the policy of smashing the gangs, it's not a bad aim to go after transnational smuggling organizations. But if you don't also present a legal option for these people to use, they either become another country's issue, but they, in the end, will become your issue too.
And Yet whenever people suggest safer routes for migrants, the answer comes back that it will just encourage more people to come and that Europe will be overwhelmed. In other words, the argument goes the policy has to be cruel. But the cruelty is not working, is it?
It's, sometimes the cruelty is the point. Sometimes it is to be seen to be cruel to the people that are trying to get here.
Yeah, that's what I meant, really. Yeah. It's performative so as to deter other migrants.
Absolutely.
Potential migrants.
But from my observation, this deterrence doesn't seem to be. Also, it's imagining that people very far away living in countries, of course people have access to the internet, but trying to understand the complexities and ins and outs of changing asylum policies and border policies of various countries in Europe. It's not something that most people that live in Europe can do, let alone if you're from another country speaking a different language. So the idea that the message gets back, I think is a false one. But I mean, look, you have an example with Ukrainians. I mean, apart from a bit of a false start when it came to the UK getting its program up and running, you haven't seen Ukrainians come in small boats because they were immediately given the right to choose which European country they want to live in. They were given the automatic right to work, for their children to access education, for them to access healthcare. And though I don't want to say the system is perfect at all and that there aren't homeless Ukrainians and people and local councils experiencing pressure, the sky didn't fall. Neither did it when Hong Kongers came here. But for everyone else, more or less, it's basically you're criminalized and you're forced to use criminal routes. And it's not enough to just say these people shouldn't do it. Because I've met lots of people, let's say in 2015, I met lots of people who had escaped directly, say, from Syria. But I would say at least 40% of people I met had been living in neighboring countries for some years already, in Lebanon, in Turkey, in Jordan, and so on, and found the conditions there intolerable. And you can see right now with Lebanon falling to pieces, to the point where even Lebanese citizens are getting on small boats to try and access Cyprus, that the policy of just the kind of NIMBYist policy of just expecting people to stay in neighboring countries doesn't work. Will offering some legal routes, safe routes, solve the whole problem? No, but for each and every one that takes one that is coming to the UK in a predictable and managed legal fashion, whereby the country can prepare for their arrival and they can be sort of hopefully integrated and helped and supported and not shoved into the black market. That will be important. It's maybe the right thing to do.
It's a fascinating series. Do listen. Andrew, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Fortress Europe, out now. Kamala Harris called Donald Trump weird, and he didn't like it. But it hasn't stopped there. More In Common researchers have been asking people what they think of the Tory leadership contest, and they say the Conservatives are too weird. Why is weird the insult of the moment? Is it just name-calling, or is it a helpful way of signalling when someone's heading down that rabbit hole? Hannah, it's hard to define weird, but you kind of know it when you see it. Which of the remaining Tory leadership candidates are on the edge of weirdness, or possibly even achieving weirdness?
How come Hannah gets this question? This one's great.
You can come in a second. Okay, so I just want to prefix my answer with weirdness and relatability are all very subjective, aren't they? So my stark raving batshit mad might be someone else's outspoken leader, I guess. Hence, people vote Conservative. But I'm glad they've done this research. I think it's the vibes is really important. It's what wins elections. My answer is Kemi Badenoch. I mean, obviously, taking aim at Doctor Who and not letting go is slightly weird.
She put out a video saying that she was going to go to war against Doctor Who. She thinks she's the Daleks.
Yeah. I mean, but there's more like this. So I had a bit of a nose down the rabbit hole this afternoon. She attacked the Museum of London for sharing the historical fact, that black women were more likely to die in the plague during the 14th century. Apparently that's woke. She claims that tackling Islamophobia means you're just creating loads of new blasphemy laws that will mean nobody will be able to have a conversation anymore without breaking the law. And on a much more serious note, she called out, and I say that in inverted commas, an excellent professional journalist called Nadine White, a former colleague of mine, for basically being a journalist. All Nadine did was ask her a question and ask for a response, and she posted it all over social media and basically accused her of being, all kinds of things, aggressive and unprofessional and so on. She was literally doing her job. And that is weird. Most politicians do not behave like that when they're approached by a journalist.
They don't. I think the reason she gets away with it as much as she does is that she frames it as common sense. And that's the irony that's going on here.
Yeah.
John, who for you?
I mean, all of that, up to and including the first time I was ever really that aware of her was the Nadine White story. And I was just thinking, you're too junior a minister to be acting like this. Just think about the power balance. It would obviously make her an absolutely terrible choice for leader of the opposition because she's not a government minister. She's not control access to power. She will need more from the media than they need from her. So she's probably not the candidate you want in that role. The other one I was going to point to is Robert Jenrick. I think is also pretty weird. I mean, just a few months before the election, there were anonymous briefings going out about how his weight loss regime and his new Caesar haircut were signs that he was the next leader of the Tory party.
Yeah, because it worked for George Osborne, didn't it?
Oh, yeah, it's just like, who does that about themselves? Who gets their mates to do that? But also, like, Jenrick is the guy who whitewashed the murals of children's cartoons on the walls of asylum centres, as if refugee children are boarding small boats to come to this country in the hope of seeing a badly drawn Donald Duck. This is incredibly strange behaviour, which the right-wing political media complex has kind of normalised and made these guys think, well, this will win us a few votes. And I actually think even on the right of British politics, most voters will look at that and go, what the hell are you doing? Why are you doing that during a cost of living crisis?
He's also, and I enjoy this fact, handing out baseball hats with the name Bobby J on it. And apparently they're quite popular. He's had to print a second batch.
Oh, he did also lose an uncontested election while a student politician.
This is your favourite fact.
This is my favourite fact. Yeah, no, it was the year behind me at Cambridge. Sorry about that. College elections had a thing called, you can get ROND, where it's just like, instead of voting for the candidate, you vote for reopened nominations. And he was so popular that he lost to Ron. And I just think, like, why would you pick a leadership candidate who every profile ever written about them is going to feature that fact, isn't it? I just think he's a strange guy.
But this isn't a new phenomenon, because John Redwood is a bit weird. Ed Milliband used to have something of the weird about him. I think less so perhaps now.
Poor Ed.
Yeah, I know, but there was that going on. Why does it seem to have more currency now, though?
I think it's got currency because we're all obsessed with this characteristic of relatability, which actually is something I'm not a massive fan of anyway. I don't know if you know, but in the publishing industry now, nobody can sell a book unless the novel has a main character that is 32 and single, because these are the women that buy books. It's like relatability is way beyond politics. It's a culture at the moment. Everything has to be relatable. And, you expect some weirdness in politics. A dedication to politics and social policy is fairly odd. I don't know about you, but I want geeks running the country. So I'm probably a little bit more forgiving of weirdness than maybe we are as a country. I'm not sure.
Well, we'll come back to that, and whether we are weird ourselves. John, the New Yorker's got an interesting take on weird, saying it's a handy way of trying to pull political debate back to the mainstream. In other words, it's a way of mocking polarising beliefs without having to engage with them. Do you agree with that?
I completely agree with that. I think that's one of the reasons it's so effective. It shuts down debates that you do not want to have. It comes out of the US presidential race, where I think it was Tim Walz who's going around. It was the one who coined it, said these guys are weird. But you can frame a lot of policy positions that way. Like if you kind of think like, these guys wandering around and the policy position that gets them most excited is whether or not they get to have control of a female stranger's uterus. That's a weird thing to do, isn't it? But you don't want to, if you start sort of debating that on the merits, then like, you get into a debate about, like where does life begin and all that stuff. In some ways it is simpler to just go, you're weird, because there is no answer to that. And this, I think, applies across the board. Like, instead of like, so I think that's an anti-Semitic comment you just made. You tell someone that they're being weird or creepy and they can't really answer back. I think it is actually a good way of kind of short-circuiting these kind of time-wasting debates that it's easy to get sucked into, especially if you're very online.
It's very good for countering sexism as well.
Yeah.
That's a bit weird. Well, that's a bit odd.
Yeah, because you can't answer back
don't
to
be
that.
sexist. Yeah.
I did. I'm aware as I said that I was talking over a woman, so that's great.
I'll allow you, John,
Brilliant
because
work,
generally
John.
doesn't happen.
But on the other hand, is it just a bit too easy? Because as we were saying, dismissing something as weird means that you're not deliberately not engaging with it. Don't we need to engage with these difficult views?
Why?
Because...
Seriously, why? Like, this is a thing we are constantly being told. And I think, like...
But it's almost like no platforming, isn't it? It's almost like saying,
yeah,
no,
I'm
you
fine
can't.
with that too.
You see, I'm not quite. Because I think they do need to be got out in the open and debated and taken apart, or we can't. Just dismissing them just makes the people expressing them even more angry and defensive.
Okay, I have an issue with no platforming because I've been trying to sell a book. And do you have any idea how many literary festivals have no platformed me? And I've never, to the best of my knowledge, been cancelled. I've not been invited because I'm not important or exciting enough. And that is true of most people on most issues. You do not have a right to a platform necessarily. Like, if you are given a high profile platform to speak, that makes you part of an elite. And I do not think anyone has a right to be a part of an elite. So I'm fine with no platforming, but I'm also aware none of this is making the edit.
But you're also saying that other people have no right to become part of the elite when you're doing no platforming, aren't you? You're saying they ought to be kept away from the elite because, they're not. That is
But
difficult.
there are always views that are verboten.
There are always views that are verboten.
We're just arguing about where the line is.
But exactly. We need to argue about where the line is, and it changes all the time, doesn't it?
I just don't think like it is on any individual to kind of like have an argument about whether or not the problem with our society is David Tennant. Or whether Project 2025 should be listened to over in the States. I just think like you are allowed to go, you know what, I'm not wasting my limited time on this earth having that conversation. You are allowed to sort of, on the internet, you should be allowed to block or mute anybody you want for any reason whatsoever. You are not obligated to have a conversation with someone.
True. Hannah, I can imagine Angela Raina calling someone weird, but not necessarily Keir Starmer. It's not really his vibe.
Yes.
Does that tell us anything?
I mean, it tells us that he's the Prime Minister. So he has to control his reactions. And obviously everything he says publicly that we hear of is calculated and it's all picked very carefully. And that's for a good reason. But I think he chose Raina for exactly the reason you say. She's the exact opposite. I can imagine her being like, oh, that's a bit odd, isn't it? As an unfiltered response. A bit like the Gogglebox response. What's your instinctive reaction to something? And hers about something might be weirdo. And as a result, that's very effective in politics because it echoes the way people respond instinctively themselves. It's the language they'd use. Whereas Starmer, you'll never hear him using the language that you would use off the cuff in your own home to describe a politician.
Yeah, you need some outriders who are prepared to be more forthright.
I think Raina's an interesting one because I think the Tories are trying to get her at the moment for being out clubbing in the Balearics on her holiday. And it reminds me of the changeover stats at the point at which you're most likely to vote Conservatives going up and up and up to like it's now in the mid-60s or something. Because I think thinking clubbing on holiday is weird. Most of us reading the Mail and seeing her clubbing are like, nice, looks like you're having a lot of fun on your holiday. Enjoy. We'll see you when you get back.
It's a bit like the whole Keir Starmer portrait thing, isn't it? I mean, why hasn't he got the right to have what pictures he wants in his study?
Yeah. Exactly.
Why should he have to stare at a picture of Margaret Thatcher?
I think not being able to get anything done without a picture of Margaret Thatcher staring at you is pretty weird behaviour, to be honest.
As I was thinking about this, John, I had a sort of are we the baddies moment. This isn't the first time that phrase has come up in this podcast, I realise. But here we are, three people steeped in British politics talking about whether other people immersed in British politics are weird. Are we?
That's very fair.
Are we the weird ones?
I mean, yeah, obviously, but I've never denied it. Like, I have never thought that a policy platform that does everything I want to win an election. Like, my opinions are my opinions, but I do not think that they are the opinions of the silent majority out there in the country. It's just what I think. And I think there has been a thing on the sort of right-wing media blogosphere, however we're talking about it these days, the whole right-wing sort of newspapers, blogs, Twitter, everything, where like they have got really out of touch and they haven't realised it. Like there was a period a few years ago during the height of the Brexit thing where like the Telegraph was running columns about Marc Francois asking, is this guy a future Prime Minister? And it's like, no, he's obviously, look at him. He's
weird.
Ridiculous. But like for some reason they have convinced themselves they have this kind of direct line to the soul of the British people. You know, another reason that I think weird is actually useful is, you know, social pressure has a function of like making sure that you stay on the straight and narrow and you kind of don't drift off into kind of weird opinions where you're going to be shunned. I think we have not done that enough with the British right, and I think we should do more of it.
We've reached the end of the show, so it's time for escape routes. How have we been trying not to seem too weird this week? Hannah.
Well, very big change of tone here, quick pivot. I've been reading a book called Arrangements in Blue, which is a book of essays by the poet Amy Key. And it's basically on creating life without a romantic partner. She's in her 40s and she's written about, her disappointments, but also her life and how she lives it as a single woman. And it is so incisive and wise and fascinating and beautifully written, very moving in parts. And I'd highly recommend it.
Oh, great. John, how about you?
I'm also going to recommend a book. I am currently reading, I think actually friend of the show, Joel Morris, the comedy writer, his book, Be Funny or Die, which explains the kind of the mechanisms of comedy. So it goes through different structures of jokes, so very methodically. And it is genuinely one of the most interesting books I've read in ages. It's not as obviously comic as you would think, given it is a book about comedy, but it's more about, I love a book about how the world works and explaining the hidden rules that I've never thought about before. And it is a great book. I would recommend that.
Well, I've been in between listening to Test Match Special, which I'm just getting increasingly fond of in ways that are just, it's hard to explain, but the sort of sheer slowness of it, and particularly earlier today when Sri Lanka were clearly going to win, and the challenge of narrating an inevitability was troubling the presenters, but they still carried it off with a lengthy discussion about their favourite kinds of beans on toast. That's been fun. But I've been interspersing that with a bit of historical fiction and Robert Harris's new novel Precipice, which is very good. It's about Henry Asquith, the Prime Minister at the beginning of the First World War, and it actually uses, which I could hardly believe, verbatim, the letters that he wrote to a woman who may or may not have been his mistress, but whom he was quite inordinately fond of.
Was this his daughter's friend?
Yeah, his son's. Well, yes, they were all friends basically. But it's extraordinary. We don't have her letters to him, so he makes those up. But we have his letters to her, and it's just amazing. And that's the end of the Tuesday edition of Oh God, What Now? Thank you, John.
I'm not weird. You're weird.
No, you're weird, John. And Hannah,
that's true.
You're not that weird, Hannah.
Sometimes, occasionally.
Okay, well, if you are, it's a compliment. Oh God, What Now? We'll be back on Thursday for our backers and Friday morning for everyone else. Thanks for listening. See you next time.